All right, let's start out in chapter 3, verse 21 this morning and read a couple of verses here. We see that he said, "But now apart from the law, a righteousness of God hath been manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets, even the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ unto all them that believe. For there's no distinction, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, being justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God set forth to be a propitiation through faith in his blood, to show his righteousness because of the passing over the sins done aforetime in the forbearance of God. For the showing, I say, of his righteousness at this present season, that he might himself be just, and the justifier of him that hath faith in Jesus." Now that is the text that we're going to be dealing with today. As I have said over and over again, this is the very central core of the book of Romans. In fact, it's the very central core of the whole total gospel of Christ. That if we grab this, we're going to have the foundation teaching, the very core teaching of the religion of Jesus Christ. When you look at the difference between the law of Moses and the gospel of Jesus Christ, you say, what is it? Well, you could go to this passage, and this passage here will tell you really the core difference between them. So we want to see what each one of these things is talking about so that we can understand really the very basic principles of the gospel of Christ. Now, so far, we stopped this last week by looking at this. Now, apart from the law, that is, we're not going to go back to the law now, but apart from the law, a righteousness of God hath been manifested. Righteousness of God means the way God makes you righteous. Now, Paul's saying here in this book now, I'm going to tell you the way God makes you righteous, separate and apart from the law of Moses. Now, we've already learned the reason for that is that the law of Moses depends on your perfect works that's there. That's what's called works of merit, where you actually earn your salvation. Now, this over here is going to be based on faith that works. It's not going to be based on works, but it's going to be based on faith that works. So it's going to be salvation by faith. But here again is where it seems like the world goes crazy when you talk about salvation by faith that works. And that is that people have a hard time grasping faith that works. They either look at it, we're saved by faith, or we're saved by works. It seems like it just has to be one of the two. Now, this is where Martin Luther made his great mistake back hundreds of years ago. That he was searching through here, and he was cutting new territory. He was studying the Bible for the first time in his life, and he came here, and finally he just kind of through an exasperation of, are you saved by faith or works? He was coming out of Catholicism, and Catholicism says you're saved by works. Now then, Paul says you're saved by faith. Luther was fighting this, and he says, now, over here, Catholicism saved by works, and he's already shown Catholicism is all wrong. So then he goes over here, and finally he takes this great leap. And the great leap that he takes is, you are saved by works, you're saved by faith alone. You're saved by faith without any works whatsoever. So that was his conclusion. And that's what he began to teach. And that's what the majority of the Protestant world will tell you today, still holding on to that teaching that he started back at that time. Now, we got to go back to the Bible, though. The Bible tells us that you're saved by faith, And then it explains it is a working faith. It is a faith that works. And so we want to keep a balance in here. So what the Bible is teaching is that we are saved by faith, on the basis of faith. Now this salvation over here would mean you deserved it. You're perfect. You deserve to be saved. This over here is by God's grace. You're not perfect. God is going to make you righteous in a way to where it doesn't depend on your perfection, upon your great works that you've got, but it's faith. Now last week we looked at this chart, not going to go back through it again, but we saw that when the Bible talks about faith, it's talking about faith that is composed of these two things. That's the only thing you can get out of faith. Faith is accepting the testimony of God. It's hearing God's word. And when you hear God's word, you accept it as true. Then on the other hand, you put your trust in it. If you accept it as true, you will put your trust in it and do whatever it tells you to do. Now, unless both of those things are present, there's no such thing as Bible faith. We illustrated it by Noah and Abraham, and you can go on and on. Any person you want to find throughout the Bible where it talks about their faith, you're going to find two things involved. You're going to find that God spoke to them. He told them to do something. Most of the time it went against all common sense, such as Abraham killing his own child, Noah building a boat, taking over 100 years to do it when nobody had ever seen it rain. So here it is, God telling them to do something, and then they did it because God said it. Even though it goes against every grain of sensibility, every bit of common sense that you have, every scientific principle that you could possibly think of, any way that you want to look at it, God said it, so these people did it. And when it was over, they did it by faith. Now, here then, in verse 22, he says, He's going to save us by the righteousness of God through faith. That is, God's going to make us righteous through faith in Jesus Christ unto all them that believe. So that's what this book now is going to be about. Then he says this in Romans 3:23. He said, for there is no distinction. Now that means there's no distinction between Jew and Gentile, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Now he puts that in to show us this way. Salvation cannot come through perfect works. It just can't be through perfect works. And the reason for that is, how many people have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God? Everybody. So if salvation is on the basis of your perfect works, there's not a person in the world that will ever be saved. But God is giving us a system whereby everybody can be saved. And so He's laying the foundation and showing that everybody, Jew or Gentile, whoever you are, man or woman, whatever it is, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So we all need then to be saved. Now, as we look at this particular section, today we're going to spend some time in word definition, because here we're going to find quite a few words. We're going to find words such as justified. What does that mean? Freely. Grace, redemption, propitiation, righteousness, passing over, forbearance, just, and a justifier. What do these words mean? Because Paul is putting them all together here in just this 2 or 3 sentences that he gives us. So we need to really identify them and see what it means. Now here is a very interesting word, and that is justify. So you can see up here it says, for being justified freely. Well, what does justified mean? Is that a big word or not? How much should that word mean to you and to me? When we read that we're justified, how much should that really mean to us? Well, let's look at what justify actually means. The word here, the word means to justify a person is to pronounce him just or righteous, to declare him not guilty. Now, before we get any farther into it, how would you feel if you were accused of murder, robbing a bank, and so forth, and they take you in before the judge and your trial is there, and you sit down and your trial begins? How would you be feeling? You're accused of being a murderer. You're going to spend your life in jail or be executed. Would you have any nervousness about you? In there? You'd be sitting there all the way through wondering what is going to happen. How would you feel after the trial is over when the judge hits his gavel and says, not guilty? How would you feel then? See, your relief would be so great that you couldn't comprehend it right offhand. It would take a while for it to, as we say, soak in, because it's such a great thing. Now, when the judge hits that gavel and says not guilty, what he's actually saying is, you are justified. You are found not to be guilty. Now, that's what God is going to do to us. We're sinners. We deserve not to be executed, not to spend the rest of our life in jail, but we're sinners, and according to Romans 6, what do we deserve if we're sinners rather than execution? Eternity in hell. That's what we deserve. See, if you're going to get what you deserve. So then here it is. He's going now to justify us. That we know we're guilty. It's not that we're not guilty. We know we're guilty. Now God is going to do something that will make us not guilty. That really is what the word justify actually means. Now there are three ways to be declared just, righteous, or not guilty. There's three ways in which it can be done. Let's put it this way. Use for an example. So, there are three ways you will not be guilty of owing me $25,000. That goes for everybody in here. There's three ways that can be done. And you can say, I'm justified, I'm not guilty of owing you $25,000. Well, first of all is, if you're perfect and you never owed it at all, you never borrowed $25,000 off of me, you've watched your finances, you're taking care of it, never had to borrow any money, you're perfect, then do you owe me $25,000? No, you don't owe me $25,000. Now the next one is that you owed it, but you paid it. Now let's suppose that Rod here got himself in trouble 5 years ago, and he came to me and he said, Lowell, I need to borrow $25,000 or they're going to throw me in jail. So I loan Rod $25,000. Now, Rod owes me $25,000, doesn't he? See? If he's going to be just, he's got to pay that back. If he doesn't pay it back, he's guilty of fraud and cheating. So now, he owes me $25,000. What would he have to do so that he is not guilty of owing me $25,000? Real simple, isn't it? Come down one day, write me out a check, say, here, Lowell, it's what I owe you. Write me out a check for $25,000, pay it off, and then Rod doesn't owe it. He's just the same as if he had never, ever borrowed it. He doesn't owe it. Now, there's one other way, and that is that he owed it, but he couldn't pay it. And so I said, Rod, I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to forgive you of the $25,000. We're just going to wipe it off of the books. I'm going to forgive you. Now, in this case, who paid the debt? Right? This case, I paid the debt. Now, is Rod guilty of owing me $25,000 now? No. He is absolutely not guilty of owing me the $25,000. Suppose 2 years from now, I get up here and I tell you, now I suppose all of you know Rod owes me $25,000 and he's never paid me. He owes me $25,000. What would be Rod's plea? He could stand up and say, no, Lowell, I don't owe you $25,000. I didn't pay it. I admit that. I couldn't pay it. But you forgave me. You forgave me that debt. And when you forgave me the debt, that means I didn't owe it. Now, there are 3 ways in which that could happen. Now, let's put it in perspective as far as it's concerned. Over here, this would be your works. You don't owe me because you've been perfect. You've taken care of it. Over here is also because of your works. You borrowed $25,000 and then you paid it back 2 years later. You don't owe it. But this over here is because of my works, not because of your works. It's nothing Rod did. Rod borrowed it. Rod spent it. Rod couldn't pay it back. Rod's in trouble. Everything about Rod is bad, but he doesn't owe it to me because of my works, not Rod's works in this particular case. Now, in this case, it is because of my grace. What does the word grace mean? We'll look at it in just a minute right here, but what does the word grace mean? Unmerited favor. It means a favor that you don't deserve. Now, Rod doesn't deserve for me to forgive him that $25,000. He came in and said, Lowell, I've spent all this over my head. I need to borrow $25,000. I give it to him. He comes back and says, I can't pay it back. There's no way in this world that I can pay you the $25,000. Rod needs to, I can sue him, take him to court, found guilty. He goes to jail. Nothing about Rod that is good. Everything is bad on this thing. But I'm good. You see, I love using this as an example. I'm good. Now, why is it that Rod wouldn't owe me that? Because of my grace. Because I'm the kind of guy who is doing him a favor that he doesn't deserve. He deserves something else, see? He deserves to go to jail. But it's due to my grace. Now, we can see this whole thing then, really, with God. If you look at it, there's 3 ways to be righteous and not guilty or justified before God. Number 1, be perfect. Don't ever sin. Well, that's what the law required, isn't it? See? That's what the law says. Be perfect. But here's another way. You could sin, and then you pay for your sin yourself. That's just like if Rod paid me back the $25,000. So you sin. You say, I admit I'm a sinner. Well, then you pay for your sin. That's fair. But what is the problem there? What's wrong with that? Totally impossible for man to do. And the reason it's totally impossible is because of the price of sin. Now, we're dealing with something now that is a big subject, and it's something that man cannot comprehend. There are a lot of things man cannot comprehend. If I were to ask Roger, tell me about eternity before Christ came. How long was it? Rod, I'll give you another test. You tell me about eternity after Christ came, on down here. Now, you guys want to start talking, explain, so we can, tell me how long it is. See? Well, you say, man can't comprehend. There's some things that man just can't comprehend. Well, how could God create the heavens and the earth by speaking a word? That's what he said he did. Now, who wants to explain that to me? See, how does that happen? You say it's just incomprehensible. I can't explain anybody having that kind of power. There are things that man can't comprehend. Now, here's another thing we can't comprehend. We cannot comprehend how bad sin is. And I want to emphasize that. you can no more comprehend how bad sin is than you could comprehend eternity. They're both going to stand and fall together. Now, here's what I mean by that. When a person sins, and you're going to pay the price, you're going to pay the price for your own sin. What do you think would be a reasonable price for committing adultery? What would be a reasonable price? It'd be pretty high, wouldn't it? In other words, you'd say, boy, a guy should, and you'd probably just really lay it on, see. Send him to prison for 25 years and do this and do that and so on. What about lying? What would be the price? Well, we'd probably come up, if you were with me, with a little lower price. We'd say, well, it's not quite that much now. We won't throw you in prison, but what's the price of sin? What's the reasonable price of sin? See? This is what man can't comprehend, because God has told us what the price of sin is. What did he say it is? It's eternal damnation. It's death. Now, to most of us, that's shocking. We'd say, that doesn't sound reasonable. That doesn't sound right. Eternal damnation? That just sounds too much. Well, let's go back to eternity here. How long's eternity? So you start in, whatever you come out, that sounds too long to me. I mean, I can't comprehend of always and always and always. I can't comprehend of it. But I can't comprehend of sin either. That's the whole point. Because what is the wages of sin? It is eternity. It's eternal damnation. That's how long it is. I can't comprehend eternity. But that's the wages, the price of sin. Now, when somebody says, why? Why? Well, that's where I can't comprehend it. I can't comprehend why it is that expensive, why it is like that. It just doesn't seem reasonable to me. But there is a reason, and there's only one individual in the whole sphere that understands how bad sin is. And who is that? That's God. God understands how bad sin is. And so God is telling us, here's the price. Now I want you to listen real carefully for the next few words. God says, here is the price for sin. And if you sin, here's what it cost you. And that is eternal damnation. Now listen carefully, because we may not get to it today, but we will next week. God is telling you the price of sin. That's important. Because God knows something that you and I don't know. He knows how bad sin is, and He knows that He's telling us how bad it is, and He knows that it's going to affect Him also, not just you and me. So, if we then come up here and say, well, I'll take this option. Somebody says, and you probably heard people say this, well, I tell you what, I don't ask for any favors. I just ask to be judged on what I am. Just judge me for what I am. You ever heard anybody say anything like this? You see? Well, okay, judge you for what you are. Now, you can pay for your own sins. This is the important thing to understand. You can pay for your own sins. All you got to do is just pay the debt. And what is the debt? If you take that route and you say, I'll pay for my own sins, what is it? Eternal damnation. So you can just go right up to the judgment bar of God and say, Lord, I don't need any favors. I'm a real man. I've always paid my debts. I've always done my part. And I'm not asking anything other than what I deserve. I'm here, and I'll pay my own debts. Fine. That's what's going to happen, you see. And it's going to be eternal damnation in hell. So, if we want to stay out of hell, we're going to have some other basis other than paying our own debts. And that's this over here. if you sin, but if you've been forgiven. So if you say, okay, I've sinned, and now then I don't owe $25,000 like I gave the example with Rod, but now I owe eternal damnation. That's what I owe. I'm going to be judged eternally for my sin. And I don't want to do that. Well, the only other way that you can do it then is to be forgiven, to have God to forgive you. That's how important forgiveness is. Now, when we look at this, we see this over here would be your works, if you've never sinned. This over here would still be your works. If you don't want God to save you, no problem. No problem whatsoever. Just tell God, I don't need you to save me. I'll do it on my own. No problem. Bible teaches that. See? So all you'll pay is an eternity without end in hell. See? That's it. But you say, I don't want that. See? I don't want that. I want to be saved. Well, the only other way is to be forgiven. And that is for God to forgive you. And that's what Paul is talking about when he says, I'm going to tell you about a righteousness of God. I'm going to tell you about the way God makes you righteous. And he said, now here it is. God's going to make you righteous on the basis of two things. I thought it was only one thing. What is it that God is requiring out of you if you want to become righteous? It's a righteousness of God based upon faith. That's what I'm going to require of you. Righteousness of God based on faith. Put your trust in me. Is there anything else involved in salvation? Yeah. Does your faith, if you have faith in God, does that really pay for sin? That doesn't pay for sin. That just means that you have selected and said, Lord, I will do what you told me to do, so you will pay for my sin. God is going to pay for your sin. So that's what I said a minute ago. Remember, God didn't just say the wages of sin is death to try to scare you and me, but he said that knowing that he was going to have to pay that price himself. So here it is. God says, I will forgive you. Now, it's going to be forgiven upon God's grace. I'm going to forgive you even though you don't deserve it. I'm going to forgive you anyway. Now, if God forgives us, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here in these explanations, but we're kind of taking it slowly here. If God forgives us, what does God have to do with sin? He has to pay the price. He has to pay the price. It would be kind of like if Rod gets himself here, trouble, he needs $25,000. So he comes to me and says, Lowell, I need $25,000. Well, suppose I take him up to the bank and I sign my name on a note promising the bank that he'll pay them $25,000. And I realize that he's promised he'd pay $25,000. That's what that note is worth. Now, what do I know if Rod doesn't pay the $25,000? What do I know? I'm going to, right? It's just that simple. If he doesn't, I'm going to. And if I don't, what will the state of Washington do to me? What will they say about me? Would you say I'm an honest man? That I'm a just man? I'm a fair man? No, you'd say Lowell's a cheat. Lowell's a cheat. Why? Because he said he would pay Rod's debt if Rod couldn't, and Rod can't. So, and then Lowell says, oh, I think I changed my mind. I won't do it either. So this is what God is doing. When God set forth salvation by faith, God is saying, here's what you have to do. And he says, now I want to tell you something. Since you can't do this, if you will believe in my Son, then I'll forgive you. But in order for God to forgive us, what does God himself have to do? He has to pay the price. That's going to come out about 3 or 4 verses later down here, and he's going to make this deal out of it. So I want you to see, forgiveness of sin is not just a little thing. Forgiveness of sin is not just something where God says, well, I believe I'll forgive them. Oh, let's see, I'll use this. Nope, it's just absolutely set, just like I gave an illustration of Rod right here. So now, in order to be justified, that's what it all comes to pass. Now we take the next word, which is grace. That word means a favor that you don't deserve. It's unearned, unmerited. That describes what God does to us. Now, the next word is freely. He justifies us freely. I'm going to ask you a trick question, so you know what to do with a trick question. Is salvation free? You look at that. Is salvation free? It says he's going to justify us freely, doesn't it? Is it free? Well, it's kind of a trick question. To you and me, it is. For instance, what's God going to charge us to be justified? What's the price tag? Turn over somewhere and read it in the Bible. How much did God say that you are to pay him or give for it to be free? See? By the way, that again is a trick question. You know that? Because what does this say? This said freely justified. That means without cost. He's not charging you anything. He's not charging you anything to do this. So the charge is going to be free. It's not going to cost you anything. But now, who's it going to cost? It's going to cost him, isn't it? It's going to cost him the death of his Son. Now, when I say these are kind of little trick questions, you see, it's kind of how you word the question. What does God ask of you? I'm giving you salvation freely. Here's what I'm asking you to give me. What is it? Your whole life. Turn around, and I want you now to give me your whole life. Totally, 100%. I want you to love me with all your heart, all your soul. I want you to serve me, doing whatever I tell you to do. I want you to be this kind of a person. I want you now to take your life, which is here on this earth, and I want you to start living that life for me. Totally, completely, 100%, give me your life. You say, well, that's not free. That's why I say it's kind of a trick question. But it really it is. Because as you're here, let's suppose that you live the maximum, you live out your 80 years up on this earth. You serve God 24 hours a day for 80 years. You have to give up pleasures of sin for a season like Moses did. You can't do everything you want to do. You do have to give up things. Now you do it for 80 years. Now you're saved. You go to heaven. How many years are you going to get to spend in that blissful, great situation that's undescribable? Somebody give me the number of years. Now we're back to Roger and Rod, and you can't even start to give me a number, can you? There is no number. It's eternity. It's unbelievable. Well, what's a relationship between 80 years and eternity? See, it's so small that it's like me looking down and trying to find a little speck of dirt on the carpet that's down there, even smaller than that. So yeah, even if you give your total life to me, it still really hadn't cost you anything. So here we find these words then coming up here. This justified and freely and such things as this. Now there's where we close. We'll go ahead and we'll define these words as he's putting it in this the next